Live. Hello, welcome to the continuation of the Christmas lectures. I actually have a side host with me today. I have Dr. Kieran Hicks. Kieran, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'd love to. So, yeah, hi, folks. I'm Dr. Kieran Hicks. I'm the course director for the postgrad and research in the games department at South Uni, and I'm also the research center director for DEMI, which is at SU as well.
That's awesome, Kieran. And everyone at the department will know everything about being juicy. But
Yep.
could you give us a quick rundown on your
On,
specialism?
on, on juiciness?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course I can. My PhD was in juiciness in video games. It's typically a thing people like to probe in, which is, I guess, why Ben's decided to ask me about juiciness today. Juiciness is one of those games design kind of terms that we use to describe lots of superfluous feedback, including things like visuals and audio and sound cues and haptic vibrations. That kind of contribute to making a game feel really good to play. And I
Awesome.
studied that lots.
Awesome. Thank you, Kieran. So, we do have with us today, we have Dr. David White, who's going to talk about simulating marine ecologies. So like a physical real-time application of games tools in something that may not necessarily be games related. So what I'll do is I'll bring David up to do his talk and pass over to the expert. So without further ado, Dr. David White.
Hello. Can you see my screen and hear me? That's the main question.
Yeah, we can. Yes, everything's
Excellent.
well.
Excellent. Lovely. Okay. Good afternoon. My name's David White. I work in games, and I generally teach computer games graphics and artificial life and artificial intelligence and those sort of subjects. But my research is generally about simulating things, so simulating ecologies and economies. And seeing what happens when we change stuff in those simulations in order to kind of try and predict events like climate change or perhaps disruptions to economies and so on. So what I'm going to talk to you today is a research project I've been involved on for several years, and it's been kind of rebooted last year, and it's about simulating marine ecologies. So we simulate what happens on a sunken ship, and the reef that the ship has become, and then we simulate things like climate change and microplastics, and seeing how that affects the balance of the ecosystems. So a quick overview of what I do in terms of the kind of science behind that. So I deal with simulations, and it's a field of artificial intelligence called artificial life. And what artificial life does, it attempts to allows kind of scientists to kind of replicate the variability that we see in the world that normally mathematical equations can't give us. So, for example, previously, before we had computers, mathematical equations were used to predict population growth or the spread of viruses and illnesses and so on. And that's great. We still do use those calculations. But one of the problems with them is that it's very difficult to measure or kind of test how the variability within a simulation or within a population will then affect that kind of change over time. So, for example, imagine if we were modeling the spread of a disease, and kind of halfway through, people started staying at home, except some key workers, and they would carry on going to work. A mathematical kind of formula is, you could probably approximate it, but it's not. As the more variability we get, the less realistic that kind of mathematical equation is. So I deal with a kind of model called agent-based modeling, and what agent-based modeling does is that using a computer, we're literally able to kind of simulate all the agents, and all these are the things, the beings, the people, or the animals, or the trees within a system. and we simulate the connections between them and how they react with each other and how they are kind of influenced by their environment. But the important thing here is that we can give those agents individual properties. So we can say, if we were simulating crowd control, for example, we could say, rather than just saying a human is an average height and an average weight and so on, we could say some people are tall, some people are short, some people are strong, some people are weak, and so on. So if we were going to simulate a crowd moving around a supermarket, then we could probably do it much more realistically. So so kind of what does that kind of look like? So if we were to say, so this is a simulation of so Newtonian physics. So we're kind of applying Newtonian equations, physics, gravity, collision, all these boxes bouncing off each other. What we could do with these boxes, for example, we could make some boxes different sizes, and we can give some boxes different weights and so on. And that would be kind of, we could probably take a snapshot of this using a mathematical equation, perhaps using some kind of fluid dynamics. But this kind of, the computer program gives us the variability to give all these boxes individual characteristics. But of course, that's not very kind of lifelike in terms of kind of the real world and humans and species and ecosystems and so on. So here's a simulation of some birds or fish or whatever you want to call them. And what's happening here is quite interesting. So each of these little blue birds has free rules, just free rules. They want to swim or fly towards their neighbors. They want to fly in the direction of their neighbors, but they don't want to get too close to their neighbors. And I don't know if you can see this little green and red triangle. That's a predator, and that's going around eating the birds. It must be a hawk or something. And what we were doing with this simulation, we were testing what happens when we give these different birds different characteristics. What if we give them make some faster, some have more stamina, some have a better field of view so they can see the predator coming. And one of the unusual things we found was we expected fitter, stronger birds to actually last longer. And the kind of surprising thing was actually the opposite. We actually found they were more likely to be eaten. And the conclusion that we came to was that actually the weaker birds are less likely to have scarpered to the other side of the screen. They're more likely to have stayed with the flock of birds, and therefore the probability of them being eaten by the predator was much less. So, which kind of leads me on to the topic of my research that I'm going to talk about today. So the beginnings of this were about 10 years ago when I was working at the University of Birmingham. So a while back, there was a Royal Navy ship called the HMS Scylla, and they towed that off the coast of Plymouth, and they deliberately sunk it to create an artificial reef. And what we did with Birmingham and also with some colleagues at the University of Plymouth, we went there, we caught a boat, we hired a ship, hired a boat to take us over the Scylla, and then we threw some kind of artificial, some robots, some underwater robots, and we got them to go down into the sea, to the reef, and to kind of like measure to see what species are present and so on. And we did some outreach to Plymouth schools. We we got them to come to the National Marine Aquarium in Plymouth, and we were asking them, we were kind of explaining what we were doing, and they were kind of asking us questions about how we could simulate life. And we also developed this kind of a simulation game for the National Marine Aquarium called Build Your Own Ecosystem. So that was about 10 years ago. And last year, I kind of rebooted this kind of research, and this is largely what I'm going to talk about today. So we did a pilot project, and we did that about this time last year. This year, I've been designing a community-designed board game, and what those two kind of stages are going to lead into is a game, a much more complex game, simulating marine ecologies and the environment. I've seen a couple of questions come through. I'm on two monitors, and the one I'm looking at doesn't have the question. So what I will do is I'll answer those questions at the end, if that's okay. So part one is a pilot project, and that's where we took the marine biology simulations that we did in the original research. These are quite complex simulations, simulating aspects of the marine life at the Scylla Reef, and we were kind of, at the time, we were trying to understand how the detail of that marine life that we programmed into it, how that affected the simulations. And so the goal of the pilot project was to turn those quite complex simulations into a computer game. And what we wanted to find out was, if we were to test this with an audience, do they find it useful? Do they find it engaging? Do they find it interesting? And so what we did, we thought, obviously climate change is a kind of big, and will continue to be a big topic, and pollution as well. So we kind of introduced, we thought, what if we simulate these ecosystems, and then we kind of introduce kind of pollution, and we introduce climate change, and we see how that affects the balance of the ecosystem. So the way the game worked was, we have three species. We've got a starfish, or several starfish, we've got sea urchins, and we've got algae. And the way these species interact is basically, starfish eat sea urchins eat the algae and seaweed, and algae just grows. Like when it stopped being, once the sea urchins stop eating it, it just kind of grows and grows and grows and turns into a bit of a forest. Now, there is a balance in this ecosystem. So if there's not enough sea urchins, then the starfish themselves will die. And if there are too many sea urchins, well, the starfish are going to be fine, but the sea urchins will then eat all the algae, and once they eat all the algae, they run out of food, and then they tend to die out of starvation, and then in turn the starfish will die. So there is a kind of irony in ecosystems that actually populations of a species rely on being predated. It's kind of healthier in a simulation that kind of higher species eat lower species, but not too much, in a balance, and that kind of keeps the entire ecosystem more healthy. So what we did with this, we set this kind of game up at the Pottery Centre in Stoke-on-Trent, and we kind of asked people to come along and have a look at it. And we showed them 3 simulations. We showed them a normal simulation. So this is just the species interacting and eating each other. We ran a microplastic simulation, and what happens there is that the sea urchins, they consume microplastics, and when they do that, it kind of fills up their stomachs with plastic, and they don't feel the need to eat, and then so they don't eat the algae, and then they kind of tend to starve and die. And then we ran a third simulation, and it was kind of simulating climate change. And what climate change does in marine ecologies, it kind of turns it into summer all year round. So what happens in the winter is that kind of most species, plants and animals as well, they tend to kind of eat far less, they consume less, they kind of tend to rest or hibernate, and there's a period of relative dormancy. Whereas in the summer, they're much more vibrant. So starfish eat and move more, sea urchins eat more, and algae, being a plant, it obviously grows more in warmer waters. And what we showed our kind of participants is how these kind of changes disrupted the ecosystem. They disrupt the balance of the ecosystem. So, for example, with climate change, for example, the sea urchins, everything's fine to begin with. Everything's moving well, everything's eating well. But the sea urchins kind of are doing really well, and they eat all the algae. And then there's much lower levels of algae, and as I said earlier, they tend to starve and die if they don't have enough food, and that affects the starfish as well. So what we were trying to gather from our participants is what kind of they were recalling from these simulations, and also what they were their opinions on climate change. Is it worth us, creating a game which educates people on climate change and the balance of ecosystems. And do people think they have a say, or not a say, I suppose, but do they feel they can influence the impacts of climate change and pollution, or do they think it's kind of somebody else's problem? And also we asked them about the game. What did you think of the game? It was a very simple game, but we kind of tried to gather what is the general consensus of what they'd like to see on a game in the future. And we kind of gathered their data, and we looked at the scores. And in terms of the open questions and closed questions, so open questions is where you ask, you might say, what happened? Do you recall what happened during the microplastic simulation? But closed questions would be, on the microplastic simulation, which of these is true? You know, the starfish ate lots of sea urchins, or the sea urchins stopped eating the algae. So it was like a multiple choice question. So we're trying to recall, or trying to gather what participants, what the people looking at the simulations, what they remembered about them. So in terms of our results, what we found was that participants scored higher on open questions, and interestingly, slightly higher for microplastics. I say interestingly because we thought, probably quite correctly, that people were probably far more aware of climate change than they were about microplastics, and telling them the idea that, yeah, in climate change it's kind of summer all year round, whereas microplastics is this quite technical idea that the sea urchins are eating kind of plastics, and they don't wish to, they don't feel the need to eat kind of as much kind of algae and so on. So that was slightly surprising. Possibly, I suspect, is that because the microplastics is quite new, and people tend to remember new and novel things, perhaps in their short-term memory better. But the fact that they scored higher on open questions is interesting. That tells us, in the closed questions, we were asking them to recall specific things, but in open questions, they were telling us what happens. And it might be the case that just because you have an educational goal in a simulation or a game, you don't necessarily know what people are picking up, what information they're picking up. And that's something that we'll consider in future iterations of the game, which I'll get to at the end. As I mentioned, yeah, awareness of environmental issues. People are far more aware of climate change. No real surprise there. What surprised me slightly, participant influence. How do people think they can influence climate change? Do they think they can influence microplastics? I thought going into this that they probably thought, well, I am just one person. I can't affect this. And I'll come back to this in the second stage, which I'll go over in a moment or two. The second stage of this research project. But surprisingly, most people said they have some or a lot of influence, equally for both environmental scenarios, which is probably quite optimistic. I suspect it means that people think it is worth doing the right thing. And the preferences for the future games design, most people would like to have more control of the game. The game was, you could move the camera, you could fly about, and you could see what was going on with the simulation as it kind of carried on. But apart from that, you had very little control, apart from selecting which scenario you want to look at. So not surprisingly, most people said, hey, we'd like to kind of set some simulation parameters and see how different things affect the game. So the outcomes of that, I wrote a paper and I presented it at Dublin, kind of the joint conference at Serious Games at Dublin this year. And in the paper, I talked about the challenges of abstracting a very complex model to a game. I talked about the challenge of modeling different environmental effects, because every time you introduce, say, what will this kind of environmental effect have on the species? You have to kind of understand, what is the kind of the literal meaning of that in terms of how does it affect a kind of a starfish or a sea urchin and so forth. And we developed insights into the participant feedback, which I kind of gave you on the previous slide. So that led on to part 2, in which we developed a card game. So I'm going to call it a board game, but it eventually turned into a card game, which I'll explain later. So in this stage of the research, what we wanted to do was, let's step back from the digital game. Let's step back from this computer game and think, what do people want from a game? If we were to gather people's opinions and on kind of climate change, on games and so on, and in a more raw, in a more kind of more basic form, because some people say, well, I don't play computer games, but board games, analog games, like most people, you know, whether you're old or young, you've probably played one. So we kind of thought, how can we kind of, what lessons can we learn from this, and then take that back to a computer game at a later stage? So we kind of followed a model called participatory action research, or PAR. And what that does, PAR, is about engaging the community as active contributors to your research. So it's basically saying, these are the people this research is going to affect most, not us scientists or as computer games developers. The people who are going to be impacted by a game and climate change is the general public. So why not get them involved in how we design a game, get them involved in collecting research, make them collaborative researchers, give them a stake in the research, ownership of the research. And what this does, it democratizes knowledge creation. So it takes it away from the expert, takes the power away from the experts, and it gives it to the people who it affects most. And so but effectively it combines research with action for social change and empowerment. Essentially, I recruited a group of people, and we kind of became the researchers. So we all collected research. So this group just happened to be a book club in Stone in Staffordshire. The typical demography, I suppose, they're probably in their 30s, 40s, 50s. People, they typically work in public services, schools, the NHS, in care. And I presented them with the idea that we were going to design a board game. And I explained, just as I explained to you in this presentation, about the Scylla Reef marine ecology and what we've done beforehand and so forth. And what we were going to design this board game based on decision making from the group, but also from research data collected by the group. And essentially our research question was, how can a game stimulate critical thinking and foster action to limit the impact of climate change in marine ecosystems? Essentially, how can we design a board game that's educational, educates people about the impact of climate change and pollution, but also kind of makes people not just aware of these changes to our environment, but also encourages them to change their behavior and act for the better. So we had four meetings, but essentially as researchers, we set out to collect two sets of data. One is about understanding, how do we understand and engage players? What do people like about games? What do people like about board games? What do people think of board games and climate change? You know, is that something they were interested in? And secondly, we asked, what do people think about education and environmental awareness. Do they think it's important? Do they care? Do they not care? Do they think that it's somebody else's problem? And so we all, as kind of researchers, we all went out with to our kind of friends and colleagues and family, and we collected data on these two topics. And what we found was, in terms of understanding, engaging players, people liked games to be simple, short, competitive. This was a very strong theme, and they kind of thought, well, we generally play games with our family and our friends, and some people put, we play games at Christmas and so on. And in terms of education and environmental awareness, people felt that games are less preachy perhaps than a pamphlet or a lecture on environmental change. And this is what I loved about this. We had a very strong, this kind of echoed the first stage of the research. We had a very strong feedback that individuals have a role. So everybody has a part to play, but in order to have that, for that to have impact, it needs momentum. But so basically, it's, yes, I will do my bit, but more importantly, everybody else needs to do their bit as well. And if we all do that, we will be able to impact. If we all change our behaviour, and if we kind of, perhaps use less CO2 and kind of pollute less, then that will have big momentum. And secondly, big business also has a moral obligation to there. So it wasn't, it's not up to us, it's up to big business. The feedback was that people said, oh, it's up to everybody and big business as well. So in terms of how we kind of applied those research results to the design, we came up with the conclusion, let's not do a board game. We realized we didn't really have the time for that, probably all the expertise either. But after playing, we played some games, and we took some games along, but one that really stuck out was one called Exploding Kittens. It was really good fun, and it was really simple to play and really simple to kind of understand as well. So we decided, let's create a card game. This is going to be simpler, easier to reproduce as well. If this game was if we were to put it on a website, schools could kind of download it, they could print it off, and that's, they could probably do that in a few minutes. Whereas a board game with a board and kind of plastic characters and so on and so forth is probably less easy to kind of to distribute. There was a few arguments about this, but there was the idea that kind of that people, when they're playing the game, they would we could all operate as a team, and because there are some board games that do that, we could operate as a team and work together to help climate change. But no, everybody said being the bad guy is fun. So if a game can encourage self-interest and competitiveness, that's going to make the game more fun. Obviously, this kind of probably goes against the idea of working together for climate change and reducing pollution. But so we thought, how do we kind of be the bad guy, but also have our goal of kind of educating on climate change and building a better future. We discussed that ecosystems are hierarchical. And the game should demonstrate this. So the game should demonstrate the balance and the importance of a hierarchy in ecosystems, and it should also demonstrate real-world influences. It shouldn't, like Exploding Kittens is it's quite far removed from reality. The game, our game, we thought should be kind of, it should demonstrate, what's going on in the real world. And it works out like this. So we had we had a card game, and we actually had a play test night as well, and we designed it as such. So we kind of designed some cards, and the idea is that you can work in teams, but there are basically teams competing against each other, or you can work as a player, as an individual. And these teams or individuals, the idea is you've got to create your own ecosystem. So you kind of create this kind of pyramid, and you start off by you try and collect 4 producers. So these are the lower order species, like the algae we've seen in our simulations. And once you collect these once you collect four producers, you kind of lock in that level. You've locked that level in. You put them on the table, and you kind of don't need them anymore. Well, that's kind of you've completed stage 1 of your pyramid. And the game worked by you had some cards kind of randomly dealt, and each go you could take a card from the pack, or take a card from the pile, and then put one of your cards back on the pile. So obviously to begin with, you're trying to find 4 producers in order to lock in that level. And then once you've done the producers, you try and lock in the herbivores, carnivores, and once you've got your apex predator, you've won. If you're the first person to do that, you've won. There are some other cards. So as well as picking a card from the pile and putting a card back in the pile, we had some kind of action cards. We've got a politician's promise, and the aim of this card has absolutely no influence on the ecosystem whatsoever. It's quite a useless card, except what you can do with that card, if you've got that card, you can say to another player, give me one of your random cards, as in you the kind of the taker, pick one of their cards. You can't see what that card is, and then you've got their card, and then you put that. The politician's promise goes on the bottom of the pack. There are attack cards. So attack cards, if you kind of give another player an attack card, they have to put one of their, for example, a producer down, back on the pile. There's overfishing cards, but also you can defend against them with defense cards, so things like research cards and fishing policy cards, which defend against those attacks. And there are more cards than this, but these are the kind of ones that fitted on this slide. So that went really well. The kind of the play test went quite well. I think the only thing that the only change that we made at the end was that we probably thought we had too many cards in the pack. Not the types of cards, but just the literal number of cards, and we kind of reduced that in order to speed up gameplay. But the game lasted about half an hour. But we think with the change, it probably lasted about 15, 20 minutes, something like that. So next steps. So we've done the pilot project. We've kind of created our card game. And the very next step after Christmas, I'll be publishing the card game on a website. It'll be a free educational resource for schools to kind of download and use in classrooms. And the next stage is stage 3, is that we're going to come back to computer games. We're going to look, what have we learned from the first stage and the second stage? What have we learned from that? And what are those lessons, and how can we apply that to an interactive computer game which simulates marine ecologies and simulates the effect of things like climate change and pollution? And the idea is that the player, they might have tasks, they might have tasks or kind of adventures or something to go on in this game, but the idea is they've got to kind of manage an ecosystem, and they get to understand firsthand how these external things in the environment affects the balance of the ecosystem. And one of the things that one of our main aims is basically, if you protect the marine hierarchy, if you protect all levels, then you need to do that. Basically, you need to do that by looking after the lower levels. But if you protect the whole of the ecosystem, then the ecosystem will then protect itself. It becomes more resilient. So that's the end of my talk. I'm happy to take questions now.
Hi, David. We did have 2 questions.
Cool.
So the first question is from Nope, not using a real name. And the question is this sort of more like the intricate form of vulnerable, infected, dead, recovered sort of mathematical disease simulation? Sorry, yes. I forgot the proper name of it.
Yes. Yeah. Actually, it's actually a good question. Yes. Agent-based models were used to simulate how the spread of COVID, we can say the word COVID, at the start of the pandemic, when the government were kind of let's just say lacking action. What they did, I think it was King's College in London. I might have got that wrong. Apologies if I have. But they developed agent-based models of how COVID was going to spread and the death toll from that. And it was those agent-based models that influenced the government into basically saying, okay, we need to lock down. So it was literally agent-based modeling which helped kind of influence government policy at that time. In fact, during 2008, 2009 was the last large, the Great Recession, the financial crisis, and it was following the financial crisis actually also that the Bank of England said we need new ways of modelling the economy. We need to, mathematical formula have their obviously their place. They're never going to go away. They're incredibly important, but we need new tools. And the Bank of England basically said, yeah, agent-based modelling is that tool. We need much more fidelity over our kind of simulations, and agent-based modelling is that solution.
Awesome, cool. We had another question from the same user as well, and I think this was in relation to when you were talking about gamifying the process.
Yeah.
They said, "Oh, neat! Like Stanford use folding home a gamified protein simulation."
Yeah, exactly, and that is something that could come out of this. If we kind of, it is this citizen science, but if we kind of if our kind of simulations are any good, and then we give them to people might kind of hopefully we hope they will kind of have their kind of it raises awareness of climate change and environmental issues, and we hope that it kind of changes people's behavior, but we also might start to learn new things, by getting people who wouldn't normally understand and play with ecosystems. They might kind of find, just as like people do speed running in computer games, that were never designed for that. We might find that people kind of start to become interested and find new kind of rules and techniques for managing ecosystems as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you very much, David.
Absolutely. I have a quick question. That's okay.
Cool.
Yeah. So participatory design is always quite an interesting process to follow. I was just curious, was there any insights that came from those participants that you weren't necessarily expecting? Sometimes I found, like in the past, they can kind of come up with quite left field, suggestions. I'm just curious if there was any really interesting insights you weren't expecting to see that you kind of gleaned from that process.
I found it really hard to hear you, Kieran. It sounded as though two people were talking at the same time.
Yeah, that's because I was. That's the nature of these shared offices, sadly.
Yeah.
Basically, were there any particularly interesting or novel insights that you picked up on from the design process?
I think what I'd point in terms about the game's design, I think it's in terms of novel, interesting thing. I think people really kind of got what was happening in terms of the people kind of understood the balance of the importance of balancing ecosystems and basically an ecosystem with more species is more resilient. But I think what kind of really has stood out to me, the two things, or I suppose the main thing is that is the positivity in that people think they can make a change. Like they really believe it. They don't think, oh, it's Coca-Cola and Shell Oil's problem. They're the ones kind of causing all this issue. Actually, people think, yes, it is their problem, but it's also our problem as well. And I think that's quite encouraging. And in terms of, as an academic, I will kind of, you write a research paper on, oh, we've developed this simulation, we've turned it into a game. Why did we do this? You have to justify it. Well, that's a pretty good justification. People themselves, it's not just me, the academic, people themselves, we have the data to show that people themselves think, that everybody has a part to play. This game will be useful. They do find it useful. They find it interesting. So I think people are far more kind of engaged and have a stake in this than perhaps, you know, at least I originally thought anyway. Yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, David. So I think that is everyone on questions. But if you do have any feedback you would like to offer us or on the talk, feel free to follow the URL here, and you can give us some feedback on the form. And this has been Dr. David White talking about how we can simulate marine ecology. So thank you, David. Thank you for your time, and thank you everyone for partaking in the talk today. Up next, we do have Dr. David Murphy. Make sure I say the right David. And he is talking about, I want to get the title correct. Before it's too late, preserving video game culture and history. So if you're interested in those classic retro games, I mean, I say classic retro games, and I was born in '97, so for many is going to be what their childhood was. If you're interested in that, feel free to hop along, and that's going to be in 20 minutes. So again, David, thank you for your insights, and there's something you're clearly very passionate about as well. So
thank you very much.
Have a wonderful day. And thank you everyone else, and we'll see you in 20 minutes.
Cool. Thank you.